This is the demo for the Fireball in Project Strife. So before we get to the Fireball class, let's take a look at where the Fireball will actually spawn. So in the issue attack method for the controllable character, we first gather up some data regarding the character and the target. We roll it up into the spell data class, and then we will pass it down into a delegate object that will contain the spell that we're going to cast. So here I get the distance between the caster and the target, and if the distance is less than 100 units, I issue the attack slash ability. Otherwise, I issue the spell fireball ability. So this uses a delegate, meaning that I create a class, assign it a pointer to a function, and pass it that data. So I don't actually call the fireball here. It is the execute down here that will invoke the fireball. This allows me to build up a queue, and I can create spells later in time instead of having it happen immediately. So if we follow the fireball inside the spellbook, this is the spellbook class. It contains the basic definition for what to do when the fireball is cast, and the main part here is that it spawns the instance of the fireball object. So the fireball gets spawned, and it's passed in information about the caster. So now let's go into the actual fireball class, which is right here. And so the very moment that we spawn the fireball, we do some basic object creation, so setting the object mesh for the fireball to give it its appearance. Then I give it some variables for the acceleration, velocity, and maximum velocity, which currently is not used, but I will probably be using it at a later time. So as soon as the fireball also gets spawned, I give it a lifespan of 20 units. So if it doesn't manage to hit its target, it will die eventually. For every frame in the animation, I keep track of its age, just to see how old it is, so that I can drive a different behavior depending on the age. So this part here is a basic check to see if the target has been destroyed or is being destroyed. Since if it is in the process of being destroyed, there's no guarantee that I can get the location of the target anymore. So this setup allows me to get the latest position. However, if the target does not exist anymore, then I'll just reuse the previous value for when it did exist. So I initialize some vectors based on the caster's location, the fireball's location, and the location of the target. And with those three vectors, I calculate some additional vectors that eventually will tell me how I can move the fireball to get it closer to the target. So if the fireball has only been alive for less than 2.5 units of time, I make it go in an orbit fashion, so it will actually orbit the caster and not go towards the target. These are the calculations I used mainly to keep it in orbit. Primarily, there's a bit of difficulty, but if I just make the fireball move 90 degrees from the caster, because it will move in a straight line, and technically it will actually move the fireball a little bit further away from the caster, resulting in a spiral movement. So to address this, I use the distance as a factor, and if the distance is greater than a certain set of units, I actually have the fireball lean inwards slightly. That should cause the fireball to still orbit the character, but it will also get closer as it orbits. Then if it happens to be closer than a certain distance, which is 101 units, it will actually orbit in a fashion that would take it far away. So this will try to keep it around 100 units away. The else statement will apply whenever the fireball's age is greater than 2.5 units, and at this point I simply have it find the target, and then it will slightly steer itself towards the direction of that target. So this divided by 20 makes it do an incomplete turn. So eventually it'll just keep making small turns towards the target. I use an additional variable to decrease the divider as the fireball gets closer, so that as the fireball gets closer it'll do tighter turns. This is to prevent the fireball from always trying to turn towards the target and never hitting it. Then lastly, I check to see that if the fireball is close enough to the target. If it's close enough to the target, I tell the target to take a certain amount of damage and I destroy the fireball. So we can see that as soon as I cast the spell, the fireball moves in an orbit fashion for a little bit of time. Then eventually it releases from the caster and moves towards the target. There's a bit of quirk on the map that I'm using that causes that weird turn that you see there. I'll be figuring that out later, but it's mostly working the way I expect it to. One of the reasons why I did not lock the coordinates of the fireball to the arrow, which would make the orbit mechanic a lot more simpler, is because there would be some weird jitter as soon as I release it from the caster. So the fireball is not linked to the caster at all, and actually has to compensate based on the caster's movement.